Welcome to the Consultancy Edge. I'm Matt Hodkinson, your host, and today I'm speaking with the wonderful Professor Joe Omani about his journey in advising consultancies. He's a professor of consulting at Cardiff University. He hosts the Consultancy Growth podcast and works with a number of boutique consultancies on their growth. Now, we spoke about a number of high-value topics, including how the consulting industry is under pressure for margin and to make the financials work, what boutique firms can do to outperform the big boys, and inevitably we talk about the future of AI, automation, and how it's shifting the world of consultancy right now. So without further ado, here is my interview with Professor Joe Omani. Professor Joe Omani, welcome to the Consultancy Edge.
Professor Joe Omani, no less. That's very kind of you. Only my mum calls me that these days. So thank you for the professional introduction.
Oh, thank you so much for being with us. Anybody who's listening in and has spent any time in the consulting sector, I'm sure has come across you in their travels. Of course, the host of a podcast yourself. I'm always very nervous to have hosts themselves on this, but the Consulting Growth podcast, of course, that you're involved in. You've written many books on the subjects of consulting, including growth, building a successful consultancy, management consultancy, management innovation in the UK consulting industry. I know that you're a non-exec and advisor to many consultants as well. It seems like you've got a lot of hats to wear there, Joe.
Yes, too many, my wife tells me, and she's probably right. I find it very hard to say no to something that's interesting, and I'm a big fan of codifying your expertise or insight, hence all the books and all the rest of it. And obviously, I'm 50% at Cardiff University as a professor of consulting, and they're obviously quite keen that I publish articles that usually no one can understand, because to get published in a journal, you have to make it indecipherable, unfortunately. So I try and translate some of that academic insight into stuff that might be useful to founders.
Wonderful. And I know that you've confided in me about the podcast before, that for you, it was really about keeping your finger on the pulse and capturing some of those conversations with consultancy leaders and what have you. So how have you used those moments, those podcasts really inform your other work?
Yeah, it's a really good point. So, I mean, for 20 years, I've been studying the consulting industry, and I see the podcast as really more data capture. So I do the podcast, and I run something called the Boutique Leaders Club. There's 35 founders and CEOs of consultancy, and we get together once a month, share ideas, knock out, act as sounding boards. And that's quite good for testing hypotheses. So, let's take an example of AI at the moment. There's a huge fuss around AI. Well, is anyone actually using it? And if they are using it, is it for a quality improvement? Is it for a cost reduction? Is it for innovation? And what are the common challenges? So the podcast, the Boutique Leaders Club, and also my advisory stuff, I see really as extensions of the research that I would do as standard. It's generating hypotheses and then testing them.
Yeah, I love that. And of course, the Consultancy Growth Network, we've both been involved in at various times, and they conducted some research recently where the respondents noted that about 9% of whom were actually successfully using AI at this point in time. So I think it is pretty early days for that.
It's interesting. So I saw their research, and it's obviously very useful. The challenge is that their respondents were senior respondents. My own research has shown that while senior people will say that they're not using AI particularly strategically or successfully, if you ask anonymously, if you ask people to respond anonymously at the bottom of the organization, 2/3 of them are using AI successfully, but 2/3 of them aren't actually telling anyone, because they're either worried that it's going to take their job, or they're freeing up time that they're getting paid for, or they've been told they're not allowed to use AI. So what you typically get is a disparity of the use of AI and automation at the top and bottom of the organization. So I think the Consultancy Growth Network, I think their research was quite useful at highlighting that, but my own research at the bottom of the organization shows that the picture's a little bit more murky than we might first think.
Yeah, absolutely. No, lots of people have been accused of cheating when using AI, but I don't want to dwell on that too much. This is fast becoming the AI
Yes,
in
yes,
consulting podcast.
indeed.
And I want to dive into that codification that you spoke of, because that's another thing that a lot of consultancy leaders are really trying to nail, is that, and you've already spoken about hypothesizing, and I feel that many aspects of business, marketing included, are iterative, that they do require you to take that hypothesis, execution, interrogation sort of model. Where have you seen that work particularly well in the work that you've done with consultancies?
So, yeah, I think the iteration is really important, and you're spot on marketing. I mean, it's a real struggle for founders, as you all know, or CEOs who, they'll come to a marketing and say, what should we be doing? And to be honest, most marketeers don't know whether they should, invest in SEO or content distribution or, sending letters to people or, webinars, whatever. But what you've got to do is take your best guess and try. And it takes 6 months to know whether you're right or wrong. And both your clients and you will probably find that a little bit frustrating. On the more strategic stuff, we're relatively fortunate now in that there's been 30 years decent research into consultancies. So some of the hypotheses have been tested, and some of them, and can't prove things on an Etch-a-Sketch in the same way that you can with the natural sciences. But for example, you need different strategies typically for your consultancy based on whether it is or should be a process consultancy, an expert consultancy, or an innovation brains-based consultancy. And I find that one of the most important distinctions, because a lot of the advice that you get from, in inverted commas, gurus on the internet is very much one size fits all. And, it doesn't take much reading or experience of several consulting firms to realize that the one size fits all strategic advice really doesn't work.
Yeah, and before we fired up the podcast today, Joe, you were speaking about, of course, the importance of not taking one voice as the kind of the authority, I guess, on what is a good way to operate. What has worked for somebody else isn't necessarily going to work for you. And I know that in your advisory, of course, you've got the benefit of all of this research and your own experiences at a much, much broader level. Where do you think consulting leaders really fall down? Is it that they do listen to one voice too often? And what do you think is the solution for that, other than engaging you, of course?
Yeah, well, that would be nice. Yes. So I think there is one thing around that in terms of listen to a few different voices. And even if you've got, a board advisor or whatever, seek out other voices, because typically and this is entirely understandable, and I've had several of my clients do this, you will, a founder will reach out to someone who successfully sold their firm for 30 million 10 years ago. And as I said to you earlier, what happens for a supply chain firm in 1989 isn't going to work for a strategy consultancy in Germany in 2024. So, and that's important because a lot of advisors only have their own experience, and you're generalizing from a success case, and that's bad science. There's lots of reasons why consultancies are successfully sold. One of those reasons is luck. Luck plays a huge part in the success or failure of consultancies, and being at the right time in the right place and with the right clients and all the rest of it. So very often founders, when they sell, they'll come out thinking, well, I know the secret sauce because that's their world. But actually, if you look at the population of firms that have been sold successfully, their routes through that journey are actually remarkably varied. And just because you sold for 20 million doesn't mean that you couldn't have sold for 40 million, or you could have done it in 5 years rather than 10 years. So getting that, I think from a CEO perspective, you should be listening not just to the voices out there, but thinking, for my business, what type of business is it? What's our secret sauce? And what's our conditions of success? And getting into that discussion will very often generate insights that perhaps are very different to that your advisors might be giving you.
Yeah, that's great advice. Context is so important. And of course, everybody's definition of success is very, very different.
Sure.
I want to learn, and I'm sure the listeners will as well, Joe, about your early foray into consulting. If you think way back when, I mean, what was it, do you think, that kind of took you in this direction into the world of consulting, right at the very beginning?
So I started as an independent consultant during my doctorate, and that was really companies. It was manufacturing companies, actually medium sized. It was the business process re-engineering period, and a lot of them were facing quite high failure rates. And so I got stuck into that really because I was studying those firms and they wanted some independent view. And when I finished my doctorate, the natural route would have been to go into academia. But I'd been bitten by the bug, and I thought, this is really interesting. So I went into corporate consultancy with a view that perhaps in 10 years I'd come back to academia. I didn't want to be one of those professors who had read all the books and done all the studies, but hadn't actually been out there and lived it. And one of the great insights, and this won't be surprising to anyone that's been in consultancy, it's very easy to come up with a list of the things that a consultancy owner should do, but they can't do all of them. So you need to prioritize them. And so working out what those 2 to 3 levers are that someone can really pull was quite an early lesson to me. And very early on realizing that there's no such thing as one size suits everyone. So I went into corporate consulting, strategy consulting, and tech consulting for about 10 years. Came back to academia, to be honest, because I was exhausted. I was working too hard on the projects and had been promoted quite fast, perhaps too fast. And when I came back to academia, it was a bit like early retirement. So first of all, I started my own company, which I grew and sold. That was a tech company in 2007. And then after that, my friends who I'd left in consultancy, often bumped up against partner, came to me for advice. And I thought, well, there's another potential job here. So I went down to half-time at the university, and for the last 20 years have been giving advice to owners of boutique firms, typically around growth, and very often with a view to some form of exit in a few years' time.
That must give you a very unique viewpoint. And I guess it is part of your CPD, your continuous professional development, to be there, boots on the ground with the boutique consultants that you work with, as well as taking the academic side of things. It must be a fascinating viewpoint you've got.
It is. And, someone asked me the other day, why would I use you in term rather than say Equitech? And I've been very fortunate in that I have either captured or developed hundreds of very useful bits of IP over the years. So, if you want to know, the best type of pricing for your services, or how to implement AI, or how to do a succession plan, or how to build a competence framework, I have resources that can help do that. So because I've been, I guess, obsessed with the capture of IP, I can go to a level of detail that perhaps some advisors or perhaps even M&A firms can't go to.
Yeah, wonderful. With your work with those boutiques, because I know a lot of our listeners are consultancy leaders within that sort of space, what are some of the most often, the most kind of the recurring challenges that you see? I know that you've had a particular focus on growth. I know that's been at the top of things, but are there any that kind of come from left field a little bit and you think catch out the consultancies that you're working with?
Um, left field, left field might be tricky. I mean, the first thing is what type of consultancy are you? And if you're a consultancy that should be process based, don't start pretending you're a strategy consultancy or a brains consultancy. If you're a brains consultancy or an experience based consultancy, what works for a process consultancy isn't going to work for you. So being very clear about what type of consultancy you should be and deriving your strategy and plan from that is the first thing. And it's quite remarkable how big some consultancies can get without professionalizing. But you do need, if you want to get past, if you want to successfully and sustainably get past 70 to 80 people, you need to professionalize. You need to have those systems and processes and all the rest of it. Even if you're an experience-based consultancy or innovation-based consultancy, because the structure then allows you to do the innovation. It allows you to solve the problems. It frees up your people from all the back office stuff that they would usually have to do. So I always say this, at least in my area of consultancy, which is kind of the 20 to 200 employee firms, there's typically 2 or 3 inflection points that firms typically struggle with. One of those is the founder and finding a successor and, you know, pulling themselves out of the business. One of those is when you get to 30 odd people, and so the founder or CEO can't see everyone's work and can't control everything and needs to start delegating and having systems and QA and processes and methods and all the rest of it. And then once you get to that higher level, once you get to the, say, 100-person mark, then professionalizing those roles. So it's no longer sufficient to have, you know, just a group of partners who like doing fun stuff. You need to have the CFO. You need to have the marketing department. You need to have the HR. Because if you don't, the partners are going to get distracted from what they should be doing, which is business development.
Yeah, wonderful. No, that's a really good viewpoint, a good reminder. Joe, clearly your clients see the value in mentorship and advisory. They buy into you, of course. Is there someone or a number of people perhaps that have been influential to you in your journey that have perhaps been a pivotal mentor in your life?
That's a really good question. There's been a few. So and I can't remember her name. This is awful, but I have an awful memory for the names, less so faces, but names. In my second year at university, my tutor took me aside, and we were meant to be studying, I don't know, 18th century Germany or something. And she took me aside and said, "We're not going to learn anything about history. I'm going to teach you how to write." And in effect, she took me through the Minto pyramid, Barbara Minto's approach to structured thinking, and spent a term or semester teaching me that. And that changed my life as far as attainment, educational attainment, but also the way I thought. And that's also allowed me to change my own students' thinking and writing and all the rest of it. And all of a sudden I started coming top of things. And it wasn't because I was bright, it was because I'd learned how to play the game. So that would be number one. One day I will remember her name and I'll write her a letter and thank her. When I was consulting, there was a guy called Simon Forge, and I was stuck on an awful project in a windowless office in Staines, doing photocopying in effect on 1,200 a day. Obviously not me getting it. And I was bored out of my mind. I was thinking of going back to academia, and he pulled me out. We got talking about haikus, the Japanese poetry. And off the basis of that, he pulled me out and got me into some really interesting high-value tech strategy stuff, which I loved and again changed my career. And I guess most recently, I've been working with people. A lot of the founders that I started working with have now grown and sold their firms, and now I get the pleasure of working with some of them. And I met a guy recently called Richard Gould, and he grew and sold Morehouse. So he was involved in the management buyout, grew it to 35 million or something, and then was involved in the sale of it. And I didn't think I had much more to learn, but I've learned a lot of him. Being professional, being kind, the way he deals with clients, going beyond the basics. So I'm still learning, and that's a really amazing thing, because that's what I've always wanted to do, is learn.
No, I think we're all learning. Every day is a school day for sure, especially in the world of consultancy.
Yeah.
Throughout your journey so far, Joe, you must have seen so many different sort of successes and wins. And I think reflecting on recent times, at the point at which we're recording this, it's been a tough year for a lot of
Yeah.
consultancies. I was speaking with
a couple of years.
It really has, yeah. Speaking with a bunch of leaders at a recent summit, and they were all reflecting on how terrible it's been. But let's keep a positive note. What are some of the moments that you have witnessed in recent times that you're particularly proud of, whether that's with client organizations or something else you've been involved in?
Oh, what a lovely question. Yes, and of course there are always success stories, even if success is, remaining flat when everyone else is taking a dive. I mean, that's been a success over the last few years. I've recently helped a company. I joined them 3 years ago as a board advisor, helped take them from, I think it was 3.5 million to 10 million, helped increase their EBITDA from 20 to about 32 points. A bit higher than I'm comfortable with, to be honest, but they yes, so that's been a wonderful journey. It's been great to see the company grow, but also the owners. It was their first rodeo, to see them grow and experience new things. And we had our differences, don't get me wrong, but my job isn't to be liked, it's to tell the truth, and to see them overcome some obstacles that were thrown their way. So that's one, I guess, financial success story. Another one, again, recently, is a firm that has completely shifted from consultancy to SaaS. And that, again, it's typically you get a very high failure rate when it comes to consultancies trying to do SaaS, but they're completely different business models. But occasionally you see a glimmer of something, you think this can work. It's going to require a lot of effort, a lot of changes in personnel, a lot of different strategy, and you either do it properly or there's no point doing it at all. And there's two firms. I've kind of they don't need me anymore. They've done their thing, and they've successfully transitioned to a SaaS firm, which is incredible, and one right at the beginning of that journey. But I have no doubt they're going to be successful, and it's just building that confidence and seeing them learn and us learn together. And sometimes the success is somebody realizing that leading a consultancy firm isn't for them. It's a hard, long slog, and there's no guarantees that you're going to be successful. And sometimes the success is someone saying, look, or perhaps me saying, is this really for you? Is there someone else you want to pass this on to? And then realizing it. You're in a very privileged position as an advisor, because you get to have those conversations. And sometimes a founder will say, well, I'm not going to listen to you. And you wish them all the best and you hope they're going to do well. But that's part of the risk that, you take, is that people just disagree with you and sometimes sack you because they don't like your advice.
Oh, that's fascinating. And you mentioned in amongst that as well about spotting the glimmer when it comes to that SaaS opportunity specifically. And I know that you must court a number of potential clients along the way. And with your background, or you're a business psychologist by qualification, I wonder, do you know very quickly when you meet a consulting leader or founder whether they're going to be a good fit for you, whether you feel they are going to be coachable, guidable, and ultimately that they're going to succeed?
I mean, I want to say no, but I think the answer is yes. Certainly on the coachability, you pick up on that very quickly. And some people are obviously quite defensive about asking for help. They feel, for some reason, they feel they should know all the answers, even when it comes to a sale. You know, a sale is typically something that a founder will only do once in their life. If you're very lucky, twice. But, you know, I've helped 20 odd firms do that. And there's no reason why someone should be an expert at it first time round. So you do get a quick view of whether or not they listen to you, and I'm fine with challenge. I mean, that's what you really want. I certainly don't know all the answers, and I'm often wrong, but it's having that conversation that's important. The biggest challenge I see is that founder mentality where they just can't let go, and they should let go, and they don't. I don't want to say don't have what it takes, because often they do have what it takes, but they perhaps have successfully taken the firm to 3 million, but they don't want to let go of the reins. They want to control everything. And even if they talk the talk, they often don't put that into practice. And that is probably the biggest struggle I've seen of firms of that size, is getting the founder out of the business. And sometimes if they hang around too long, they can actively damage the business.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, the timing's crucial, isn't it, with that?
Yeah.
I want to get your particularly unique viewpoint on the world of consultancy, Joe, in terms of what you observe when it comes to exciting trends or shifts in the way
Sure.
that consultancies are operating. What are some of the things that you're observing at the moment, and why do they really matter? What does matter at the moment?
Okay, so I mean, you've kind of got the everyday froth of consultancy, but I'm, you know, I suppose as an academic, I'm more interested in long-term trends. And so, what the big trends over the last 15 years have been pressure on margins, more competition, especially in the boutique space, the lack of innovation in the big firms because they've pursued the high leverage codified model of work, which means they've had to buy firms up. Movement of private equity into the consulting space, which has only really been evident in the last 12 years, which has helped the growth of the boutique industry. And it's kind of driven this build to sell model, which really wasn't a thing 20 years ago. Um, the pressure on margins, and especially over the last 3 or 4 years, has had consequential effects, which have been less innovation than consultancy used to have, less training, higher utilization rates. And then at the macro level, you've got the competition from banks and you've got competition from tech. And so you're kind of seeing an industry that used to, at least until the 90s, you know, big fat profit margins, big fat fees, trebles all round, as Private Eye used to say. And that's no longer the case. Clients are a lot more demanding is another big trend. They often come to you with the answer, what they think is the answer, and they can then take that up through an RFP process, through procurement. So there's been all these pressures on the consulting industry. And people will say, well, Joe, why is it still growing then? Well, a lot of that growth is international, and most of that growth is through acquisition. And a lot of the growth is on top line rather than bottom line. So if you look at profit per partner, it's not increasing in the same way that it used to do at all. So there's lots of pressures on the industry, and most of that is bad news. The good news is that a lot of the fun innovation stuff, because the big firms have become so commodified and so leveraged, the fun stuff is happening at the boutique level. And obviously, a lot of founders of boutique firms got out of the big firms because they didn't like the way the culture was going. You know, the shift from Arthur Andersen to Accenture is a very good example of that. And so many founders have set up firms partly to make cash, yeah, but also to create a working environment that they enjoy, and almost to get back to consulting what it used to be. And so client satisfaction levels with boutiques, employee satisfaction levels with boutique employers, And there's a third one. I can't remember what the third one is, but on many metrics, boutiques outperform the big firms. Unfortunately, they can't charge the same fees because they don't have the same brand, and they very often can't do the multinational work that the big firms do. But I think there is a lot of promise and life in the boutique industry still. A lot of that requires firms to grasp innovation. Talking a little bit about AI and automation here, but also adding value where the big firms can't add value. Now, of course, a lot of these firms will end up selling to the big firms because, as I said before, the big firms are buying their way into innovation. And that typically has quite a high failure rate for obvious reasons. But there's still a lot of life, fun, and creativity left in the boutique space, and that's why I enjoy working there.
Wonderful. I can see why we got you on now, Joe. You've got clearly a very, very broad knowledge of this whole space. I want to touch on a couple of things you mentioned there, and it's reconciling for me that financial side of things, pressure to deliver and at high profitability, and with the PE firms coming into the space as well, obligations that are being created there, and marrying that with, as you mentioned, the client satisfaction, employee satisfaction side of things. Do you think, as a broad brush, consultancies have become more focused on the money side than the impacts they're creating for others and for their people?
That's a really good question. And I don't want to give the answer that it all depends, because it obviously all depends. There's got to be something beyond that, right? Mm-hmm. So you need to think, well, what are the drivers here? Well, number one big driver, as you mentioned, is private equity. Generally speaking, I'm not a fan of private equity, at least when they take a controlling interest. If they're taking 50+% of the firm, then I think that's usually a disaster waiting to happen. I've seen in many cases that pressure on firms causing them to having to, sell at any cost, which is a bad thing for clients, increase their utilization rates to ridiculous levels, which is a bad thing for the employees and therefore the clients, and generally put the screws down on the founder who is then unhappy. And then, so first of all, you've got that driver, the private equity driver. You've then got the build to sell driver, and there is a common expectation put out there by some quite big names in the space that you can build and sell a company in 5 years or 10 years if you follow a specific method. Yeah. And you can, but the trouble is you don't know which ones can do that. And that journey is awful. And I know this because one of the famous guys who has done this, I interviewed him and he said, it nearly ruined my marriage. I wish I'd never done it like that. It nearly tore us apart. But at the same time, people are looking at that as a role model. Yeah. And so this, don't get me wrong, I gladly help firms grow and sell. But number one, not every firm can do it at the same speed. Number two, if you're trying to do it fast and create very high margins, sometimes that's going to be at the cost of client value. And so you've got to think about your long-term reputation. But also you've got to enjoy the bloody journey, right? There's no point leaving as junior partner at KPMG, starting your own firm, and then creating a firm that no one really likes working in. And I've been involved in a few of those firms, and I very often extract myself, because if it's a firm that's really putting the screws down on the employees, then I don't really want to be part of it either. So I do think there's a balance to be had there, and I think there's a lot of drivers for that tension between quality client delivery and profit or profit per partner, let's put it that way. Yeah. But I would say the majority of boutiques aren't in that space. The majority of them are, trying to grow, trying to do their best, trying to build an enjoyable environment, and trying to provide high value. And at the end of the day, if you focus on client value in a half decent market, then you're going to have long-term success. You might not sell the company for, 30 million in 7 years' time, but you're going to enjoy the journey and you're probably going to be successful, because at the end of the day, your reputation, your testimonials, and your referrals are the basis of a successful boutique.
I'm so glad you told that story, the alternative side of the whole built to sell, because
Yeah.
I mean, I've seen organizations who, once there was a sniff of a sale, actually took their foot off the gas of customer value. And when the sale fell through, inevitably, they ended up selling their book of clients at a huge discount, and nobody won. The clients were left in the gutter and everything that goes with it. Building on the idea of trends, though, Joe, and you mentioned, of course, that you've got a viewpoint on long-term trends. If you were to project, and I know there's a bit of crystal ball involved here, but what do you think consultancy leaders need to be looking out for in the next, say, 5 to 10 years, for example?
Well, I know we've talked about it, and we might not want to go into in too much detail, but certainly automation and AI. The AI has been shown to increase already. Has been shown to increase consultant speed of delivery, quality of delivery, and amount that they can deliver. And that's now. And it's not increasing at an exponential rate, but GPT-5 will be out next year, and it's likely to, this is the worst AI we've seen. If you add to AI automation, reasoning, low code, no code, and the various dashboards that are available and tools that are available, you're going to be in a space where that high leverage model of humans that the consultancy industry has focused on for the last 100 years actually becomes a leverage model around technology and humans, and potentially around technology. So obviously, you've got this triangle leverage model of lots of juniors at the bottom and, a couple of seniors at the top. I think we're increasingly moving towards more of a diamond figure, where you don't need so many juniors. And that's not just cost reduction, that's also quality improvement and the enablement of services that we haven't seen before. I literally had a conversation this morning with Richard Gould, as it happens, about our own intellectual property when it comes to growing and selling firms and what to be doing with it. And we both came to the conclusion that you need, in order for the maximum number of clients to get access to it effectively, you need to integrate it with technology. And that is a challenge for a lot of firms that have only ever thought about themselves as a people business.
Yeah, I was going to ask about the kind of cultural shifts that you expect to accompany that. And also, I guess, when we do change from this pyramid model, perhaps to this diamond model, less reliance on the juniors, is the opportunity then for juniors to lift themselves up into that more specialist sort of category, to arm themselves and almost to be the champions of technology within those consultancies of the future?
Well, that's the ideal, isn't it? But the reality is that we're talking fewer juniors, and therefore that pipeline of talent becomes a little bit strangled. And as AI progresses, the capability of AI is going to go further up the organization. So I don't think we're ever going to get to the point where AI or automation or anything else is going to do consulting sales for us, because it tends to be face-to-face, it tends to be long-term trust, it tends to be reputational. If that ever happens, it's 100 years out. However, okay, so now we might be talking about the creation of reports, number crunching, writing proposals. In 2 years, we might be talking about the quality management of that. In 3 years, we might be talking about the end-to-end process of that project. governed on a low-code, no-code implementation of automation plus AI. So what you're increasingly getting is, if you look at the triangle of the organization, increasingly the capability of machines is going to be taking jobs further up the pile. Now, I think consultancy is probably going to be impacted at a slower rate than most other professional services for reasons I can go into, but it's still going to happen. So at the moment, yes, a consultant plus AI will generally, although not always, outperform AI by itself. Within a year or two, we're probably going to get a situation where the vast majority of consulting tasks will be better performed by AI by itself. And so then you think, well, let's move away from tasks to processes. So therefore, the consultant who can tie together tasks into a process and automate them will do better than a consultant who can't. But then when AI and automation can do that for you, or it's become embedded in other enterprise software, then you get a situation, well, do you just have a set of partners at the top of the firm and the rest of it is automated, give or take? So it's going to be raising some interesting challenges quite quickly. And by quickly, I mean in historical terms, over the next 3 to 5 years. But there's other trends out there that, are also, the trends that I talked about before are still at play. And then eventually we might be in the situation where you've taken AI almost to the top of the pyramid. And then you think, well, do clients need consultancy firms at all? Mm-hmm. Why can't they just hire the business implementation of GPT-6 and pump their own information into it and get the right advice? Now, there's reasons why that's always going to be a limited model, but we're probably only talking 10 years out before that's a realistic option. I'm sure people will be selling that capability beforehand, but I don't think it's going to be capable of generating the quality that you'd expect.
Yeah, the quality is key for sure. I want to reflect on a couple of things we've discussed so far, Joe. I mean, one, of course, is the last couple of years, how difficult it has been for many. Again, projecting forward some of these issues and changes that are coming apace at us, AI and automation, just a couple of them. Have you noticed an increase in the importance, I guess, of resilience in consultancy leaders, and what advice do you have for anybody, whether they might be your clients or otherwise, about how they prepare themselves for change, prepare themselves for the less than rosy times?
Yeah, okay. So yeah, specifically around the less than rosy times, it's tough, and it's been tough out there, and many firms have had to make redundancies, and not just redundancies of people that deserve to be made redundant. Some good people have had to go, and then you've got, as you say, you've got the pressure of automation and AI, which is also creating pressure on jobs. Resilience is one of those interesting words, isn't it? That everyone wants to be resilient, but we're only human. And I often feel when founders are telling their juniors to be more resilient, that sometimes it's like, well, actually, there's a lot of reasons why your juniors might be genuinely struggling. We're not working in the office very often. We're not face to face. We've had COVID. There's been pressure on wages. Perhaps their friends have been made redundant. To be affected by these things is human. And telling people to be more resilient isn't necessarily helpful in those cases. It might be an unrealistic ideal. And also founders, as well as myself, tend to look back on themselves as juniors and say, well, I burnt the midnight oil and I worked 16 hours a day without any sleep for 6 months and all the rest of it. But then, 2/3 of us probably have mental health problems, maybe as a result of that type of lifestyle. Do we want that for our children and our children's generation? So I think there's a big caveat to that. But at a more macroeconomic scale, I think founders are really bloody struggling. A lot of them don't get me wrong, there are some firms out there that are flying at the moment. They tend to be in the tech or finance space, or both even, or environmental. But it is tough during recessions and during tough periods. You need to bite the bullet. You need to make change. You need to cut fast and cut deep. You need to be as honest as you can with people. The great thing about boutiques is they can pivot quickly. And what I did a study on firms that were successful in COVID, and it was those that pivoted quickly. Sticking to your knitting isn't a good idea if that knitting is being unraveled by a kitten at the other end. So I guess, two things. One, that boundary scanning. What else can we be doing? What else should we be doing? Are we selling services that are really in their twilight of their lives? And also thinking about, making contingency plans for what if. And most firms, I would say, over the last 2 years have actually had to draw down on those plans. And it's bloody tough. The consultancy, this is the really interesting thing historically. Consultancy has grown on average 8% year on year for the last 100 years. All of a sudden, for the first time ever, we've had 3 years where that's pretty much flatlined. Yeah. And people are expecting to go back to go back to the old normal, hit the growth, and you see this a lot on LinkedIn. People saying, oh, well, once the interest rates are cut, once Labour's in, once the US election has been done, we'll get back to. But I think it's similar to the interest rate argument. I'm not sure if we're ever going to go back there, which means the emphasis, academics have said this for ages about static markets. You need to innovate. You need to pivot. You need to scan your boundaries, get information, ask your clients, all the great stuff that we used to do when we were starting off our firms, and find out what we should be doing in 2 years rather than just sticking with what we've always done.
You've almost preempted something I was about to ask there as well, Joe, which is if there will be firms out there who are looking to pivot, those that are actually at the early stage, they're at the starting line really with their consultancy as well. If you were starting your own consultancy tomorrow, what focus areas would you really be honing in on, do you think?
I would do low code, no code automation with the integration of AI. The opportunities now to make a real difference, very often a cost saving to client firms at relatively low cost. And it's not expensive to learn this stuff either. You can pretty much learn it with the basis of what's on the internet. So I have no interest in starting and growing a firm anymore. I don't like managing people, which is why I'm not going to grow a firm again. But if I was going to be doing something in that space, it's learning Microsoft Power Automate, learning Zapier, and starting to use APIs to tie tasks together, create low-cost processes that save your clients money. Number one, you can charge a lot for it. Number two, the market itself is growing at 20% a year. So if you're not growing at 20% a year, you're doing something wrong. Number three, investors will give you an extra couple points on the multiple. So instead of getting 7.7 times EBITDA, you'll be getting 11 times EBITDA. So already, just by being in that sector, you're creating the conditions for success for the firm. Again, there's still a lot of luck involved. Founder mindset is absolutely crucial. You've still got to get the client through the door, but you're always better off starting in a winning market with a winning service than you are starting in a static one.
You've created a conflict between heart and mind in this podcast host. I'm tempted to cut that bit and have it for myself, but we'll probably leave it in there. Joe, thank you so much. There's just one thing that I always end our broadcasts with, and that's the snog, marry, avoid section.
Oh, blimey. Okay, go on then.
Now, I'm not going to, it's not the snog, marry, avoid.
Right.
Snog in
Okay,
this
good. My wife can hear every word we're saying. So,
well, it should be the answer to all three, of course.
of course,
Apart
yes.
from the avoid.
Well, no, apart from,
the
yeah,
avoid.
come on.
Snog is a quick win. What would you say is a quick win in consultancy that everybody should know about?
For founders, do you mean?
Yes. Yeah. Founders, leaders.
Look at your pricing. Revise your pricing. Look at fixed cost, fixed pricing. Look at value-based pricing. Founders spend too much time thinking about increasing sales. Don't get me wrong, it's very, very important, but it's difficult. Very often I'll go to a firm and I'll think, actually, you can put your prices up. You can increase your margin by 15% just by looking at your pricing.
Yeah, wonderful. Great tip. The marry is what's an essential, one tool, one strategy or practice that you couldn't live without.
Getting feedback. You can't develop your services or run your life or whatever in a box, whether it's marriage, or whether it's your consulting services, whatever you do, you've got to get the feedback of the person who you're trying to add value to. And it still amazes me how few consultancies actually go out and capture genuine, detailed client feedback outside of the project that they're delivering on.
Yeah, wonderful. And lastly, and avoid, what would you ditch? What is one consultancy practice you think that founders, leaders need to get out of their practice as soon as possible?
Recruiting in the image of the founder, which I don't see as often as I used to, but it's a recipe for disaster.
Yeah, absolutely. No, we need a good mix of personalities, and that rarely works. Joe, it's been an absolute pleasure to have you on.
Likewise, Matt. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and we'll see you again soon.
Cool. Thank you. Take care. Bye-bye.